tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
I want to turn our attention to this proposed class action that's been filed against the federal government, specifically Transport Canada. And it is a proposed class action on the vaccine mandate for people in the aviation sector specifically, which was technically done under different orders than the general federally regulated workplace vaccine mandate. But this was an order that meant flight attendants, pilots, other people working in this industry would be terminated, would be suspended, would in some cases be coerced into early retirement. And we'll talk about that in just a couple of moments here. But there is a proposed class action. It's been filed on behalf of Free to Fly Canada. There are three representative plaintiffs, Greg Hill, Brent Warren, and Tanya Lewis. But ultimately, anyone who is affected by this, if the class action is approved and certified, will be a beneficiary of this. So basically, unvaccinated employees in Canada's aviation sector. I want to welcome to the show from Free to Fly Canada, Greg Hill, who is a pilot with a major Canadian airline and joins me now. Greg, it's good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks so much appreciate being here, Andrew. Thanks so much.
Now, I should say, I actually happened to meet you on a flight when you were working, and you got me safely to my destination, which I appreciated. So in your case, you've been able to go back to work, but for some of your colleagues, that wasn't the case, as I understand it.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey. I think for all of us, the last 2 or 3 years have almost disappeared into a somewhat dark gray continuum. So it's hard to remember exactly what happened when, but certainly those of us that were out of work for an extended period of time remember that well. And as you point out, there are some of my colleagues who are not back to work. When the mandate was suspended last June, the majority did go back to work slowly over the next month or two, generally speaking. But there are a group of employees at WestJet, for one thing, that refused to sign a very egregious piece of a memorandum of understanding, essentially agreeing, which required them essentially to go against their conscience and say, well, WestJet did respect my charter rights. WestJet did respect human rights. Sign this document and then you can have your job back. And to their credit, as far as I know, to a single man and woman, they refused to do so because these are people of principle that we're not going to compromise based on conscience. So I appreciate you bringing that up because there does seem to be a pervasive attitude that we're past this, that we've moved on. I was just speaking to a friend of mine that's in healthcare. We've got a couple in my local community, and people think they've all gone back to work. Well, they haven't. There's a cabal amongst the hospitals, certainly in the province of Ontario, that is not bringing them back, to the detriment of the population as a whole, who are short of doctors and nurses and other staff in hospitals who they simply have not brought back. So it's a great thing to bring up because it's not well understood.
Let's talk about what the actual, we don't need to get into the legal weeds, but what is the real objection here? I mean, as I understand it, the case really hinges on that the government was forcing violation of the contracts that you and your colleagues had. And I mean, obviously we know that there are, in some cases, pretty stringent protections through collective bargaining that have been fought. And then the government just comes in with this mandate that trumps that.
Right. Well, I mean, the primary strategy and the angle here, and listen, we've sat back and watched the, I'll call it, challenging judicial landscape in this country for the past year or so, and I think that's we're certainly hopeful to our credit, and that isn't to disparage anyone who's made a viable effort to make headway legally, but it's enabled us to get some understanding of where the courts are at right now, and it is a challenging environment. And so out of that, this is what we put forward. And what you're alluding to is what's called inducement. That we, as you said, we fought hard as employees to have a standing with our companies and an agreement. And listen, at the end of the day, we want the success of the airline industry. We want people to be traveling, not staying in their 15-minute cities or otherwise. We want them moving about the world freely as free citizens. So ultimately, that's what we want, and doing our part to get people safely, as I did with you on that one day, and it was a pleasure to chat with you briefly. We have these agreements. Well, this interim order came in, and it induced a breach of that contract. I mean, just as an example, And it's been a beef, at least of mine personally, and I'm sure with a bunch of my other colleagues, is it was stated that we were on a leave of absence. Well, I mean, there's no such thing in any contract I know of an involuntary leave of absence.
Yeah.
The aviation industry is prone to all sorts of ups and downs. It trends with the economy or with things like asinine COVID policy, for instance, right? So you've got circumstances where former military guys, let's say, will say, hey, there isn't a lot of work for me here right now, or I may be furloughed. So I'm going to go back to the military. I'll take a leave of absence and I'll go back for 2 or 3 years. But there's nothing contractually that says you will involuntarily be put on a leave of absence. So that's just one example. Well, we've had people suspended, which is a better word for that. It's not actually a leave of absence or outright terminated. So that's the simplistic angle. And again, I fly airplanes. I'm not an expert in the law, but that's kind of the 35,000 foot view of what we're looking at here.
Let's talk about a little bit here where the liability lies. I know the proposed suit is against Transport Canada, who issued the mandate, but in your view, were the airlines themselves, witting participants in this, or were they victims of this? Because I know when it came to the vaccine mandate for passengers, for example, it's Air Canada or WestJet flight attendants that are, demanding you hand over your proof of vaccination, but it's not their fault. They're enforcing a rule that is coming from a government mandate. When this came up, did the airlines push back against the government at all, or was their view that, anything that lets us, keep moving on and get the bailout money is fine with us. We're just going to go along with it?
Yeah, I mean, you're touching on a number of pieces that we've been fairly vocal about over the past couple of years. I guess, as much as I'll say, they were pretty enthusiastic in employing these. Once we were past that October 29th deadline when this interim order came out, it was fairly common if you were speaking with a manager, and we pushed back hard. I mean, individually, a lot of my courageous colleagues were quite vocal, and of course, the management was prone to typically say, "Hey, what do you want us to do? We've got to run an airline. We're doing what we need to do. It's the government's fault." And there's certainly, obviously, this is our point. It was pushed and forced down this road. But even before this came out, there was all sorts of things happening within the industry that seemed fairly enthusiastic. And at the end of the day, I mean, they want to make money, so it's understandable. But we can't live in a society where we just take these God-given rights and toss them out the window. And then the point being on this end of it, if you want to use an analogy, even with your home life, if somebody comes into your home, a group of people, and ransacks it and runs down the road with your possessions, you're not typically prone to just sit in your house and shrug and say, well, at least I still have the four walls to sit within. And that's essentially what's happened. The majority of people have gone back to work, but there's been no willingness to replace the lost income. And it's not just lost income. There's intangibles here as well. People lost their marriages, they lost their homes, they lost relationships, and all sorts of things directly related to the loss of employment.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think oftentimes people who are disconnected from the situation would say, okay, yeah, they were suspended for a bit, they got their jobs back, everyone move on. But it is very difficult to move on when you're one of the people that has just gone through what you've described there, which I don't think is difficult to imagine. And you also look at the way that it would breed some fairly nasty thinking among colleagues when, all of a sudden you've been outed in for this one thing, and then you go back and your colleagues probably know why you were gone, and there might be some discontent there, and also just people that were forced out of the industry, which I heard a lot of, people that own businesses that were shut down that just decided, okay, maybe there's no point and I'm going to go and get a job that's not fulfilling, but I could work it. I mean, I know that when I looked at some of the comments that have been made by Free to Fly, people that wouldn't have retired, they weren't ready to retire, yeah. They didn't want to retire, right. But it was just, all right, well, maybe I have a few years left, this is something I'm going to do now. That's not a win. That's not a win. They're still victims of this.
No, and I appreciate you bringing that up. It's essentially retirement under duress. And I, just top of my mind, there's like two faces in my brain of guys that I have enormous respect for that refused to concede. And that's the road they went down. And they made it clear they weren't retiring because it was time to hang up the headset and move into retirement. It was done because of because of the mandate. So, as relates to the work environment, I will say for the vast majority of my colleagues, and the flight deck's a fascinating place. You're essentially locked in a closet with somebody for hours and hours at a time, right? So the conversation can be stimulating, and it's typically not terribly heated. But I will say, when it does come up, and it inevitably does, people talk about what you were doing last summer, and it was like, well, working in a little manufacturing plant or whatever, and you'll have a conversation. The majority are incredibly supportive, up to and often including saying, I got so much respect for you, and I did not want to go down this road, and I wish I would have held out myself. There's the odd person that typically just, it's awkward silence for a few seconds and you talk about something else, right? Because you're not going to get into it. You got another 5 hours before you get to Seattle or something, right? But for the most part, certainly the visceral feeling as we ended up later last year was, don't come near me with a booster, amongst the majority of my colleagues.
Yeah, and I think that was the turning point for a lot of Canadians when there was that one press conference. I can't remember when it was. It was around the time they had suspended the vaccine mandate, the broad sort of array of them. And the health minister, Duclos, had said something along the lines of, it's just a temporary suspension. And then there was another press conference where they talked about reevaluating their definition of what it meant to be fully vaccinated and reconstituting that around being up to date. And there were a lot of people that got their 2 doses, maybe even that got their 3rd dose, that were being told by the government that, there could come a time where you're unvaccinated because we've just changed what it means. And I think a lot of people that were kind of on the cusp, like you've just talked about, really did draw a line in the sand there, or would have had the government really gone ahead with that and said, no, now you need a booster every 3 months to be considered fully vaccinated. Because at that point, you are no longer your own individual, insofar as you ever were. You are no longer making your own choices. If your job is contingent on renewing your vaccination status every 3, 4, 6 months. And I think there was a fear among a lot of people that that's where we were headed.
Well, and I remember that distinctly because I was actually working in a manufacturing plant at the time, and I took a little break from gluing pieces together to watch that press conference, and I remember thinking, wow, and I would almost suggest it was somewhat of a trial balloon by the government to see what kind of feedback they were going to get, and we are living in a little bit of a Truman Show, I would say, here when it comes to the state as a whole. And even with these mandates themselves, if you look at us here in the aviation sector up in Canada versus in the States, the troubling reality, and I think this is something everybody needs to take as a takeaway, is collective action matters when it comes to standing up when it matters of conscience. Because at the end of the day, it was somewhat of a cost benefits analysis. And sadly, once we got right down to the wire in that date, it was a fairly small crowd of people across all sorts of industries that were willing to say, I'll give up my job, I'll give up my home, I'll give up whatever it takes because I'm afraid of the right things down the road, right? Jordan Peterson talks about that. It's not necessarily courage, it's understanding the bigger picture. Whereas in the States, there was a couple airlines where there was enough guys and gals that, and I'm not talking 40, 50%, it's not a big number. I don't know what it is. Let's say it's 10 or 15%. Just said, don't come near me with that thing or I'm not flying your airplane. And the airline did a cost benefits analysis and thought the airplanes aren't going to move and it's going to fall apart in a hurry. And so as we go forward, this COVID was a season. I'd say we've got very deep seasons of challenge coming up. You speak to them all the time, Andrew. And unless people are willing to stand up, and the biggest of all, in my view, be willing to give things up, give up comfort, give up convenience, give up status quo, give up your reputation. Because a lot of us conceded based on what people were going to say about us, and that's a pretty low threshold. But unless we're willing to really do that, we're in for a real deepening season of challenge ahead. And I think that's got to be our takeaway as citizens of this once great nation.
I'm being told by my producer that the longer you talk, the more our viewership just keeps going up. So what you're saying is resonating with people. And if you're watching live, do share it. And I think what you mentioned there, Greg, is incredibly important in that a lot of the problems that I saw with the COVID restrictions, of which there were many, is that they were inherently meant to divide and isolate people so that they couldn't do exactly what you just described. I mean, when it was literally illegal to go and have dinner with a neighbor or a friend or a family member, you can't actually sit around a table and talk about why this isn't right and talk about what you're going to do
Right.
and plan and plot and scheme and all of these things. And I mean that in more of a joking way than
Isolation, right?
yeah, exactly. And I think the same thing here. I mean, you have pilots and flight attendants and other people in the sector that have very strong unions that we were talking about earlier. And all of a sudden that union is not really standing up in the way that it could.
Well, and it was really they essentially left the room. Let's be honest. I mean, that's what happened. We've got all sorts of things happening in aviation right now. We see WestJet going out on strike, and some of the unions across the country, like the very next morning, I'm talking within 8 hours, had a 1 or 2 page statement to all of their thousands of members about how we need to stand in solidarity. And it's a little bit of a thorn in the side of guys and gals who were about to be terminated. And termination for a union, it's like thou shalt never go there. I mean, I can give stories of pilots that have done pretty rough things over the past 10 or 20 years, and the union fought hard to keep them employed. And you've got people, for a matter of conscience, that's just said, I'm not going to go down this road. Not because of myself, but honestly, because I love my kids and my grandkids. And I don't want them to live in a world where the state can do this to us as citizens. And the unions were silent. They said nothing. And I'm not talking for a couple days or weeks. I'm talking, we were going to our union saying, you haven't mentioned us for 6 months, 9 months, we've been out of work, and we're going to be terminated in a month. Could you maybe just mention that we are here in the background? It's a little bit hard to swallow. And I will say, I'm not saying this out of resentment or bitterness, because I think that's a very dark place that we can go as well. And you see that in I would say the like-minded community a little bit. I think we've got to take a deep breath, keep our wits about us, be the adults in the room, see ourselves as leaders across the nation. What we desperately need right now are men and women of principle who are willing to lead this country back to where it needs to get. And the way to do that, again, is to count the cost. To say, I'm willing to give things up for the next generation and the generation after that. Because if we don't, again, we're in for a dark season here.
Seeing the airplane behind you, I think I know the answer to this question, but I do have to ask, why did you even want to go back? I mean, after what happened to you, which I imagine would feel like a tremendous affront to you as an individual, that, you know, your contributions, your service, your identity didn't matter. Why did you want to go back into that world after?
Actually, it's funny, that picture. I was sitting more like this the other day, and I thought that my head's in the clouds. I hadn't really thought of that. I typically sit here when I do interviews, but my daughter painted that for me. It's a favorite. But that's a good question, Andrew. It's not one I get asked normally, so I gotta take a moment. I wrestled with it. I wrestled with it a fair bit. I guess on some level we fought hard, and I do. If I'm going to fight for something, I try to think about it fairly carefully. And so if I'm fighting for my job back, it's a little bit disingenuous when you get the opportunity to say, no, I'd rather do other things. The vast majority of us got into aviation because, for me, when I was 13 years old, my father was a military man. I flew around in a C-130, which I ended up flying myself in the military. And I love it. We love the job. It's different every day. It's challenging. You know, insert all of the cliches that you've probably heard before. I don't want to go on and on about it, but it's a fantastic job. It affords all sorts of perks and otherwise. But at the same time, we did fight to get our jobs back. The job affords other opportunities. And part of that is what I'm doing here with you now, is advocating for things that I'm passionate about. And so that's the long and short of it. Is we fought long and hard to get here. I put in a full career in the military before I got to this job. And the other blunt, honest piece is aviation. Unless you've got some other skill, I didn't work, to go to dental school on the side or anything else. It doesn't transpose terribly well to other employment. So I found myself at 3:00 in the morning shoveling parking lots and things during my year out of work. So some of it's just the practicalities of getting back to a good job that we love. But it was difficult. But I would say that the moments that I have run across managers, that I have run across other union members, I've been meticulous, I believe, in being careful with what I say, with being professional and trying to be kind in the way I say it. So I have no shame when I come across these people. I wasn't rude or personally disparaging, but there's times when I sense a difficulty on their part individually with our encounters, because some of the things that have been written and said, I just scratch my head and I think, yeah, man, you're a smart guy. But you've kind of hung up your conscience along with common sense in doing this. But people will do strange things sometimes for a sizable paycheck. And that's part of the problem, is the government has got us by the paycheck, or got many of us by the paycheck.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got to learn, not to get ourselves in so deep that we run out of choices, and to create a life around us where we are able to make some independent choices going forward. And I know a lot of people are doing that as well.
Well, I appreciate your service, and also appreciate your taking a stand in this way and joining us today. I've got a fair bit of travel coming up this summer for work, so I'm sure I'll see you in the skies again. I certainly hope to. But Greg Hill from Free to Fly Canada, thank you so much, Greg.
Thanks for the opportunity, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.